I'm currently on a beach on the south coast of Devon in England, and this body of water behind me is the English Channel. Now, if this video had a slightly higher budget, what I do now is jump into some kind of speedboat and zip out 12 nautical miles. At which point, I would tell you that we had reached an invisible line. For as long as we remained this side of that line, we would remain in the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. Cross over that line and we'd be bobbing about in international waters. Bob too far and eventually we'd cross over another invisible line and find ourselves in the jurisdiction of the French Republic. The existence of these invisible lines and the division of the world up into different countries with different laws and customs is so foundational to so many different aspects of our lives that we often fall into the trap of assuming that it has always been this way. That countries and borders are some kind of natural phenomenon. Yet, as soon as we take a moment to think about it, this obviously isn't the case. Archaeological evidence shows that human beings have lived in this area for somewhere between 40 and 45,000 years. And a few people would argue that those early humans would have referred to this patch of land as England, or themselves as English. In fact, as we'll see shortly, you wouldn't have to travel anywhere near as far back in time to find a period in which the very concept of a country, particularly in the specific way that we use it in the present, would be outright baffling to whoever you were talking to. There are plenty of videos and channels on YouTube which tell interesting stories about countries, customs, maps and borders. In this video, I want to dig deeper, to explore what exactly a country is, the process of their evolution and invention, and finally, what might happen to them in the future. So, before we can begin to discuss the emergence of countries as a means of organising the world around us, we first need to unpack precisely what a country is. And in doing so, I think it's helpful to replace the somewhat vague word country with the slightly more technical term nation state. For the phrase nation state, in all its hyphenated goodness, helps to articulate the manner in which what we often think of as a singular phenomenon, a country, is usually actually comprised of two separate phenomena. Let's begin by getting a handle on each of these ideas, the nation and the state, individually. Firstly, what is a nation? Stephen Crosby defined a nation somewhat wordily as a community of kinship, specifically a bounded, territorially extensive, temporally deep community of nativity. For our purposes today, however, it's perhaps enough to borrow Benedict Anderson's description of a nation as an imagined community. The nation thus refers to the community of human beings that we think of when we think of the Polish or the Japanese or the Swazis. It is the sense of commonality and camaraderie that often exists between people who consider themselves to share a nationality. We see this expressed fairly clearly in international sports, where people are willing to pay huge sums of money and travel thousands of miles to cheer on athletes who they have never met, but who they nonetheless feel an attachment to due to them considering themselves to belong to the same nation. Now, many right-wing political nationalists view nationality as one and the same as ethnicity or race. Others have instead viewed the nation as a more voluntary association, what's often referred to as civic nationalism. The 19th century thinker Ernest Renan, for example, wrote that a nation was not simply a group determined by the configuration of the earth, but instead a spiritual family, based on a shared feeling of having common glories in the past and a common will in the present. It's this more voluntaristic, civic view of the nation which we often see invoked by liberal politicians, such as in descriptions of America as a nation of immigrants. Either way, the imagined community of the nation is given substance by both the shared sense of a shared history, described by Renan, and the notion of a shared culture, the songs, stories, food, attitudes, character traits, and anything else that might come to be described as French or Argentine or Madagascar. This sense of community and identity provided by nationality is deeply important to a lot of people. In fact, it's pretty much taken as a given that all of us should feel ourselves to be members of one of these imagined communities. As Anderson writes, it is simply assumed that in the modern world, everyone can, should, will have a nationality as one has a gender. Despite this, these communities are, and can only ever be, imagined. Even in a tiny country such as Nauru, with its estimated population of just 9,770, no individual can hope to ever have a meaningful relationship with every other person who considers themselves to be Nauruan. Furthermore, the perception that the imagined community of the nation is an expression of shared interests elides deep inequalities and exploitation between its members. Before we go any further, however, it's useful to introduce the second aspect of our nation-state formula, the state. If, in relation to our everyday understanding of what a country is, the nation refers to the ideas stuff of community and culture, the state refers to the political apparatus. Depending on which country one has in mind, the state might include the parliament or congress, the monarch, president or supreme leader, the court system, the police, the army, schools, the civil service, the tax office, in some cases the press and or religious institutions. As that list suggests, states can take many, many different forms. The defining feature that all states share is that, as the German sociologist Max Weber put it, the state is the only human community that successfully claims a monopoly of legitimate physical violence for itself within a certain geographical territory. By this, Weber does not mean that all states are constantly engaged in physical violence, but that the state is defined by its ability to settle disputes through arresting, imprisoning, or otherwise inflicting violence on people without having to answer to a higher body. I would wager that when most people think of a country in the present day, it is a nation-state which they are thinking of. A political unit in which a single state governs a single nation. This is in spite of the fact that when we look at the world around us, we find numerous examples in which there is not such a clean alignment between these two phenomena. In Scotland, Catalonia and Quebec, to name but a few, we find examples of nations which do not have their own states. In a slightly different mode, Northern Ireland is presently governed as part of the United Kingdom, yet many who live there consider themselves to belong to the nation of Ireland. Across the world, and for many, many different reasons, we see similar disconnects between nation and state. Yet, these exceptions generally only go to show how ingrained the idea that nations and states should go together is. For in each of these places, we find movements demanding, through various means and with varying degrees of success, a shift towards that perceived norm. There is a lot to be said about how nations and states interact. We could, for example, foreground the fact that when a country goes to war, it is generally because it is in the interests of the state to do so. Nevertheless, few people are willing to lay down their lives for the tax office. The state will therefore lean on people's identification with the imagined community of the nation to present a given war as an opportunity for the nation to claim glory, settle scores, or act as saviour to the oppressed, all of which are far more appealing invitations to enlist. We'll certainly touch upon some of the ways in which states and nations interact a little later in this video. For the most part, however, I want to focus on how these two phenomena came to be seen as so inseparable. Which I guess means it's time for a little history lesson. The first thing that we need to establish in trying to tell the story of the nation-state is which came first. I think the manner in which modern states so heavily dress themselves up in the iconography of the nation often leads us to assume that it was the nation. In fact, states regularly actively work to convince us that this is the case. Go to a country's national museum or look through their school curricula, and you will often find that they begin telling the story of their nation many thousands of years ago. Such narratives can lead to a perception that the nation in question has, in some ways, always been there, a notion which is particularly problematic in the case of settler colonial states. More broadly, this can lead us to the assumption that the concept of the nation is an eternal one. That people have always considered themselves to be part of nations, and that the state merely emerged as a means for those nations to govern or be governed. Some scholars have argued that this is the case. Subscribers to a view of nations referred to as primordialism hold that, as Umut Özkarimli puts it, nationality is a natural part of human beings, as natural as speech, sight or smell, and that nations have existed since time immemorial. Others, collectively known as ethno-symbolists, argue that, whilst it is wrong to describe nations as a natural phenomenon, nations have existed in one form or another for a considerable matter of time. Anthony D. Smith, for example, writes that we find in pre-modern eras, even in the ancient world, striking parallels to the modern idea of national identity and character. Today, however, we're going to take what's called a modernist position, which seeks to stress that, whilst there might have been parallels to nations throughout history, the forms of collective identity which existed in the ancient and pre-modern worlds were not quite the same as those which we describe as nationality in the present. What's indisputable is that states have existed for some time. Different researchers propose different societies as having developed the first state. Francis Fukuyama, for example, awards this title to the Qin dynasty, following its establishment of a centralised government in China in 221 BCE. James C. Scott places the date much earlier, locating the earliest states in the southern alluvium of Mesopotamia, near modern-day Basra, in around 4000 BCE. Such disagreements are partly a result of different definitions of what should count as a state, but the matter is also complicated by the fact that after their first appearance, it still took many thousands of years for states to really catch on. See, viewing things from the present day, most people would probably view the emergence of the state as an undeniable good. It's certainly unlikely that you would be able to watch this video, or that I would have had the tools to make it, had our ancestors not taken those first steps towards a more complex way of living. This view is encouraged by the social contract theories of governance forwarded by Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Thomas Hobbes, which imagine our being governed by states to be the outcome of a voluntary trade-off, in which we give up some aspects of our liberty in return for safety and stability. In reality, as Scott argues in his 2017 book Against the Grain, early states were founded on coercion and exploitation. They were often politically chaotic and were breeding grounds for disease. In short, if given the choice, and many people weren't, submitting oneself to the jurisdiction of a state would have rarely seemed like a good deal in comparison to less formalised ways of living. It's for these reasons, among others, that states didn't truly become a dominant presence in the world until around the 1600s. One key event often highlighted by historians of Europe is the Peace of Westphalia, a set of two peace treaties signed in 1648 to bring an end to the 30 Years' War. A key cause of that conflict, which led to somewhere between 4.5 and 8 million deaths, was the manner in which political and religious jurisdictions in Europe often overlapped and conflicted. On top of this, countries were constantly trying to interfere in the domestic affairs of other countries, particularly with regard to religious issues. In order to address this, writes Daniel Philpott, Westphalia made the sovereign state the legitimate political unit. It established the precedent that states had the exclusive right to set laws within their own territory. Whilst the sovereign states of the 17th century may have begun to resemble modern-day states, however, they were not yet nation-states. See, across the globe, the states of the 17th century were largely monarchies or empires. If there was an identity which accompanied the state, it was simply that of the king, queen, emperor or empress. While some people might have supported their ruler and recognised themselves as living in their territory, that monarchical identity isn't really one that was available to anyone other than the monarch and maybe their close family to feel a cohesive part of. The dominant mode of communal identity in this period was instead that of the religious community. Whilst this might have manifested physically in one's local place of worship, in terms of mental conception, these communities took little heed of national borders. To be a Christian, Muslim or Buddhist, regardless of sect or denomination, meant imagining oneself as part of a near global community which was open to membership by anyone, no matter where they were born. To consider the emergence of the modern country then, we have to take into account the invention of the nation. But before we do that, I must first tell you about today's video sponsor, Surfshark. Actually, it's just me, Tom. I was acting. But I do want to tell you about how you can take control of your identity and privacy when surfing the web by signing up to the fantastic VPN services of Surfshark. Head over to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas, get 83% off a 2-year plan and an extra 3 months for free, allowing you to securely and privately browse the web for just $2.21 a month. Surfing the internet these days can be kinda eerie. It often feels as though every website that you visit knows exactly who you are and where you are. Surfshark allows you to get back in control of what websites and your internet service provider can see about who you are and what you get up to through essentially creating a private internet connection to keep you safe and secure whenever you're online. Surfshark has tons of great features. One aspect I love is the ability it gives you to convince websites that you're in other countries. This is particularly great when used with streaming services, as it can either allow you to get access to region-locked platforms such as BBC iPlayer and CBC Gem, or unlock tons of extra content through letting you use different countries' versions of Netflix and the like. So, if you want to take advantage of that time-limited offer of 83% off a 2-year plan and an extra 3 months for free, you can support the channel by letting them know that I sent you through heading to surfshark.deals/Tom Nicholas. Now back to that stupid Englishman, yes? It took the interaction of several trends and events in the 18th and 19th centuries for monarchical and religious identities to be replaced by the imagined communities of nations. The most abrupt of these events were the revolutions in America and France during the late 1700s. The former saw a group of people gain their independence from a king, and the latter saw a group of people execute one. Unless they were to install new monarchs, this left them with a quandary. See, the state sovereignty, which we discussed a moment ago, was invested directly in the monarch or emperor, hence are sometimes referring to such figures as sovereigns. Where was a state to gain its legitimacy and its identity from, if not from an individual ruler? Well, in both America and France, we begin to see some interesting language being used to describe the post-revolutionary settlement. The United States Declaration of Independence declares that governments are instituted among men, deriving their power from the consent of the governed. In France, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen asserts that the nation is essentially the source of all sovereignty. In both instances then, we find the idea that rather than stemming from a monarch, a state's sovereignty and legitimacy comes from the people, or the nation. Who was included in that people or nation, and whose consent to be governed was actually taken into consideration, was of course another matter. It would be another 87 years before the abolition of slavery in the United States, and women didn't gain the right to vote in France until 1944. Nevertheless, in these declarations, we find the germ of the idea that rather than being identified with an individual ruler and their dynasty, the state might be the political expression of something called a nation. Of course, a handful of rich guys declaring that such a thing as a nation exists didn't suddenly mean that everyone felt a deep connection to the national imagined community of the territory in which they lived. That process, in America, France and elsewhere, took much, much longer and was influenced by several other political, religious, social and economic trends. One such trend, which predated these revolutions, was the growth of what Benedict Anderson calls print capitalism. See, where the early publishing industry had mostly printed books in Latin for the wealthy and educated, from the 16th century onwards, they began to print more and more volumes in vernacular languages, those which people actually spoke in their day-to-day lives. This had a couple of important effects. Firstly, it led to linguistic standardization. Previously, a single country could contain dozens of different dialects. Eric Hobsbawm highlights that at the time of the French Revolution in 1789, 50% of Frenchmen did not speak French at all, and only 12 to 13% spoke it correctly. The printed word, however, contributed to the promotion of one language as more important within a certain territory, whilst at the same time standardising how that language was written and spoken. Secondly, the production of books for a certain linguistic community, or proto-nation, contributed to the cultivation of a shared national culture. Ernest Gellner highlights that the development of this shared culture was rarely democratic. Instead, he writes, it most often manifested as the general imposition of a high culture on society where previously low cultures had taken up the lives of the majority. In short, he suggests that the localised folk cultures of ordinary poor people were often wiped out as political and economic elites established their own cultural preferences as those of the nation as a whole. This is perhaps a simplification, however, Gellner's foregrounding of the power dynamics at play in who got to decide what the shared national culture looked like is instructive. For, among other things, Gellner points to the shift towards a school-transmitted culture, rather than a folk-transmitted culture, as being another key force in the development of nations. During the 18th and 19th centuries, many countries began to establish some form of state education. This again helps to establish a greater degree of cultural consistency across a territory, but also ensured that it was the state, and by extension those wealthy enough to be allowed to vote, that got to decide how a nation's past, present and future was taught, which artistic and literary works were included in syllabi, and thus what the substance of the national culture was. In fact, where earlier I suggested that there was an inconsistency between the idea that the source of a country's sovereignty was the people, and the limited number of those people that actually got a say in how a country was run in this period, Hobsbawm suggests that this might be the whole point. For while such ideas were useful to the emerging bourgeoisie in legitimising their overthrow of monarchs, when the dust settled, they turned out to be far less keen on sharing power with the working class than their initial pronouncements might have suggested. The idea of the nation, argues Hobsbawm, thus became a manner in which the state, which again operated in service of its wealthy electorate, could maintain or even establish the obedience, loyalty and cooperation of its subjects or members, or its own legitimacy in their eyes. Alongside guiding the development of already emerging processes then, Hobsbawm suggests that there was also a fairly naked trend of inventing traditions as a means of further fostering allegiance to the nation. Thus the vogue for adopting national anthems and national holidays during the 19th century. Nevertheless, the idea of the nation turned out to be more than a passing fad. With startling velocity, the nation-state became the accepted ideal for what a country should look like and how it should operate. We see this in the anti-colonial movements which gained momentum during the 20th century, most of which expressed themselves in national terms. Where the British had usually referred to India as a subcontinent, for example, the struggle for independence was led by the Indian National Congress. Partha Chatterjee warns against assuming that previously colonised countries merely mimicked the national forms of their former colonisers. He writes instead that the most powerful as well as the most creative results of the nationalist imagination in Asia and Africa are posited not on an identity but rather on a difference with the modular forms of the national society propagated by the modern West. Nevertheless, these movements did operate on the broad assumption that an independent state should draw its legitimacy from its relationship with the imagined community of the nation. And this scenario has pretty much continued into the present day. A sentiment that runs throughout the scholarly literature on nations and nationalism is that belief in both the existence of nations and the idea that nations and states should be congruent is so widespread that it almost goes unquestioned. But let's close out this video by briefly exploring that almost. the most part in this video, I wanted to focus on the history of our contemporary understanding of countries and how we got to where we are today. Nevertheless, I always like to end with a bit of a provocation. And so I thought I'd wrap things up by saying a few words about the potential futures of nations, states, sovereignty, borders and countries. In 2018, The Guardian published an essay by Rana Dasgupta, who wrote that the most momentous development of our era is the waning of the nation-state, its inability to withstand countervailing 21st century forces, and its calamitous loss of influence over human circumstances. He suggests that despite a resurgence in nationalistic posturing by figures such as Donald Trump, Vladimir Putin, Narendra Modi and Viktor Orban, the nation-state is an increasingly impotent force when compared to multinational corporations such as Walmart, Amazon and Shell. In fact, he frames the right-wing nationalisms of those figures almost as the death throes of the nation-state, a final hurrah by governments so desperate to prove what everyone doubts, that they are still in control. This is not an unpopular assessment, and there is a great deal of truth to it. For one, we live in a world of gigantic corporations. If Walmart were a country, it would have the 26th largest national economy in the world, with its annual revenue exceeding the GDPs of Thailand, Nigeria, Austria and Ireland. Such companies have also become adept at playing countries off against one another in order to secure the best deal with regard to taxation and regulation. This has, at time of writing, led to the Biden administration pushing for the adoption of a global minimum corporation tax. The need for states to work together in such a way further highlights their individual powerlessness. And in more formal models of international collaboration, such as the European Union, we find an even clearer ceding of sovereignty to supranational institutions. While such analyses ably summarise things as viewed from the perspective of the states, however, they elide the view from below. For whilst capital and people living in the global north can, pandemics aside, move around the world in an increasingly frictionless manner and thus imagine themselves to be living in an interconnected cosmopolis, that experience and that imaginary are not open to all. To point to one very basic way in which this is true, regardless of their personal feelings about nationality, people who are legal residents of many countries in Asia and Africa will simply find it much harder to cross a national border due to the passport that they hold. Furthermore, many of the resurgent nationalisms that Dasgupta suggests reveal the weaknesses of the state have led to increasingly authoritarian and violent policing of borders. We thus find ourselves in a position where the world looks increasingly borderless and cosmopolitan to those at the top, whilst for those at the bottom, it remains anything but. More broadly, we have to acknowledge how resilient the nation-state form has proven. People have been predicting its downfall almost from the moment of its birth, and yet still it remains central to the way in which we think about the world around us. Whilst it is likely that the nation-state form will persist for some time, however, we can all benefit from being far more critical about the naturalness of nations, the legitimacy of states, and the manner in which both those phenomena are wielded in our collective discourse. Thank you so much for watching this video. I hope it's been worthy of your time. If you found it interesting or enjoyable in any way, then I would be super grateful if you'd consider sharing it with a friend, either online or off, who you think also might get something out of it. Thank you, as ever, to J. Fraser Cartwright, Richard, Kaya Lau, David Brothers, Max DeVos, Alan Gann, Luke Meyer, Gary, Dylan Gordon, Dickon Spain, Greg Miller, Bill Mitchell, Al Zweigart, ZC Rees, Brent Cottle, Shab Kumar, Colin York, Anil, Alexander Blank, Niels Abildgaard, Sophia R, President Dwayne Elizondo, Mountain Dew Herbert Camacho, Sergio Suarez and 2Bro2B for being signed up to the top tier of my Patreon. If you'd like to join them in getting early access to my videos, copies of the scripts to them and more, then you can find out how to do so at patreon.com/Tom Nicholas. Thank you so much once again for watching and have a fantastic week.